Fortunately, there is good news and bad news in our market. The good news, even in face of the pandemic, we are starting to see more multiple offer situations on listed properties. The bad news, multiple offers are sometimes a sign of not having enough inventory to service the demand. In such a competitive market, then, how can a buyer make his or her offer more attractive to a seller? I was asked to discuss in one of my video podcasts some ways to get an offer moved to the top of a stack of multiple offers other than just offering an unrealistic purchase price. I want to make clear before I discuss this that I don't do the business of negotiating contracts, so I'm no expert on this, but I do hear lots of stories from people who are experts. I will share what I've learned. Other than offering significantly more than list price, some people have suggested that offering more than average earnest money makes it attractive to a seller. To me, increasing the earnest money does not give the seller any more incentive than offering the average earnest money, because if the buyer terminates the contract under one of several rights to terminate, all the earnest money is refunded to the buyer. There's really no advantage to a seller to have more earnest money, unless, of course, the buyer defaults and just hands the earnest money over to the seller, which rarely happens. If I were a seller, I'd rather see a more significant option fee. That fee is not refundable to buyer if buyer terminates under several of their rights under the contract. It would be the buyer's risk of paying that significant fee. And the risk comes when the buyer inspects the property and the property is not in the condition the buyer chooses to buy. The buyer has forfeited that earnest money. What happens when the buyer inspects and finds defects that the seller should have disclosed but failed to? Does the buyer then have the right under that scenario to receive a refund of their option money? The answer is no. There's nothing under the seller's disclosure notice statute that would say if the seller is false in his presentation of the seller's disclosure notice that the buyer receives a refund of that option money. No, the only recourse a buyer has for a seller's failure to disclose a defect is a suit for misrepresentation. Under that, a buyer has to first prove, to recover on a lawsuit for misrepresentation, that the seller knew or should have known of the misrepresentation when he made it, that the buyer relied on that misrepresentation, meaning they didn't independently verify and rely on new information, and the buyer was damaged by that misrepresentation. So, without a lawsuit per se, that option money is not refundable. That's a risk of the buyer that the buyer would necessarily have to be willing to take. Another idea to maybe get your offer presented to the seller in a more timely fashion and before several other offers are received is to make the time for acceptance of the offer extremely short, meaning make the offer good for something like one day or even a few hours, after which the offer is no longer effective. The seller's agent then has a duty to present the offer to the seller in time for the seller to accept it. Presenting the offer to seller after the offer expires is not effective representation and does not put the seller's interest first. Of course, if the seller is never going to accept it anyway, making a short time period is irrelevant. But the seller's agent has a duty to present it to the seller. Another idea, but with more risk to the buyer, is a buyer could make an all-cash offer on the property even though he or she intends to get third-party financing. All things being equal, sellers prefer all-cash contracts over ones conditioned on buyer being able to obtain financing. By making an all-cash offer, the buyer has no right to terminate the contract if then he or she cannot qualify for the financing they want, nor do they have an out because the property doesn't meet the lender's underwriting requirements. But if the buyer is willing to assume that risk, buyer can close with borrowed funds even though they wrote an all-cash contract. The difference is they have no contingency to get out of the contract. Finally, sometimes adding to the contract a cover letter from the buyer expressing buyer's dreams for the home and qualifications for ownership will make the contract more attractive to the seller. I hope these suggestions may help with ideas as you start writing your contracts in this crazy market. Allegiance Title strives to be your trusted resource for results. Thank you for your business.